Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone who's joining. Thank you so much for joining us today for our September Webinar Wednesday. This is our fourth Webinar Wednesday, I believe. The first with one of our organizational partners, IFAW. Just some ground rules for today. Well, first, I'm Sarah Weber. I'm the Communications and Marketing Manager for SCB. Some ground rules for today is that you're all coming in muted. But we do really want you to be able to ask some questions. So if you could please type any questions that you have for the presentation in the chat box. I'll be monitoring those and then we will ask them at the end. The presentations normally last between 30 and 45 minutes, and we have whatever time is left for questions at the end. I'll be asking them as they come up. And we'll see how many we can get to. If not all of them are answered, feel free to email me at the end if you'd like me to pass them on to our wonderful presenter for today. So today we have Neil Greenwood from IFAW. Neil has worked for IFAW for the past 16 years in the programmatic and operational team within the Southern African region. In his role, he oversees the landscape conservation, animal rescue, and wildlife crime work within the region, ensuring that the teams on the ground in Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe meet their project objectives. Over the years, Neil has also provided a technical advisory role on USAID, INL, and IWT-funded programs in the remit of landscape conservation, combating of wildlife crime, and translocation of elephants, ensuring IFAW fulfills and exceeds its commitments to donors, implementation partners, and government strategic partners. So with that, I will leave Neil to it. Reminder, please type your questions in the chat. We would love to have your questions throughout. So yeah, great, thank you.
Sarah, thank you very much. That was quite an introduction. I'm going to start by saying good day to everybody, and then we'll cover all the bases from across the 24-hour spectrum. Thank you very much to everybody for joining me. I hope you find this a useful exercise. What I'm essentially going to be talking about today is summed up as landscapes and those that inhabit them. So I'm going to give you a broad overview of the work that IFAW as an international organization does through our Southern African regional office. So without further ado, let's move ahead. I think one of the things that is quite pertinent within the region is that Southern Africa has a very rich biodiversity, which extends across multiple countries. So we very much look at that from a landscape level, which I'll explain later. But I think, as we're all aware, there is ever increasing competition for space and resources within the continent, and those are having an impact on wildlife, communities, and individual animals. So IFAW has taken a holistic approach to addressing the threats, and we work both with individual animals and in securing all of the systems and support within the landscapes that it helps for their existence. Within the region, we primarily focus on three areas of work. That's the conservation of landscapes, combating of wildlife crime, and then the rescuing of orphaned elephants, which are very oftentimes the unfortunate victims of habitat fragmentation, habitat loss, but more pertinently at the moment through wildlife crime and poaching, which is having a devastating impact on some of the populations within the region. Although IFAW covers the Southern Africa office's remit is basically the same as that of SADC. We focus primarily on three countries at the moment, those being Malawi, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. Within Malawi, we're actually working within what is regarded as the Southern TFCA, which involves Kasungu, Lukusuzi, and Luwambe national parks, both Kasungu being in Malawi and Luwambe and Lukusuzi respectively within Zambia. And there what we're focusing on is landscape conservation, the protecting of the landscape, which you'll see in the picture here, shows a very stark interface between communities and the protected area, and that's ever increasing. So there's a real need to protect these last bits of protected areas and habitat. It's very times referred to, especially within the Malawi context, that the protected areas are basically these small pockets of landscape within a sea of people, and it's no more true than from the photograph you see here. The other area that we do work with within under the landscape conservation remit is community engagement to enhance conservation outcomes, and we also try as best as possible to work within a scientific framework to help to influence governments' decision making, as well as measuring our impact within those areas. And to that end, we do a lot of work with Pretoria University's Conservation Ecology Research Unit in better understanding elephants, their population dynamics, their spatial behavior, and all of those things to help guide us in influencing how we look at these landscapes, and more often than not, how we link these landscapes together in a way that makes sense for both the communities that live in between them, as well as the elephants that need to move through them. So within the landscape conservation portfolio of work that we do within the region, one of the main areas that we work on, and have been doing so since the late 80s, is working on park security. And that involves building the capacity through training of rangers to develop a really effective and competent, motivated ranger force. We do this not in isolation, but actually with our primary partners being the government agencies themselves. So we aren't setting up any parallel systems. Rather, we go in and work with the government to enhance their systems, to effectively secure the parks, put in place whatever strategic measures need to be put in place, and then help support these rangers in the vital job that they're doing by working with support systems like rations and fuel. And within the Malawi-Zambia landscape, we even have sort of like a tailoring workshop, which produces the uniforms as per government standards, which you'll see one of the ladies here is wearing. This is all part of the process that we use because it effectively works with our other components of work, which is community engagement, which I'll come to later. Together with that, it's all great and well to have incredibly well-trained rangers, but those rangers within the context of protecting an area, very oftentimes the technology that is with them is out of date. So we work very closely in setting up radio networks, as well as providing monitoring systems for the rangers to help them to effectively do their work. These are all based on an information-based enforcement system. So we're trying our best to move away from the reactive way of doing poaching to a more proactive one, where using the technology allows us to understand better what the situation is on the ground, and therefore put the right human resources in the right places at the right time to protect the wildlife populations within those areas. Just to give you an example, so in the Kasungu situation in Malawi, when we arrived there in 2015 at the request of the government, there was an estimated 48 elephants left in the park. In the 80s, early 90s, there was about 1,200. So that gives you an indication of how badly the population declined due to poaching. Subsequent to us moving in and assisting the government in building that capacity, the population is now sitting around about 85 elephants. So it's a real motivation also for the rangers to see that actually the hard work and the dedication that they're putting in is actually turning the park around. But as these populations of elephants increase and become less fearful of people and start to move around within the parks, there's always the the situation where there is a potential for human-wildlife conflict. So we work very closely with the rangers in helping them to address this, also in looking at where it makes sense to put up fences, and then use the community to help us in doing a fence attendance program, who are the guys that then are able to monitor the fences and make sure that the integrity is in place. Taking this approach really works well, because what it does is it also alleviates that responsibility off of the rangers, who themselves are needing to do other functions. And so the fence attendant scheme provides an incentive-based opportunity for the communities who are most affected by human-wildlife conflict to be able to do something proactive. And it also then helps the rangers to be able to be better utilized in the enforcement of park security. The other area, as I've been sort of alluding to during talking about the park security side, is the community engagement. We absolutely, and I think everybody is aware of the fact that oftentimes your communities who are bordering on protected areas are often the most marginalized and vulnerable of communities. These are oftentimes people who are have very limited income sources and means, and usually survive on a subsistence agricultural practice. This we've seen in both Malawi and Zambia. And so what we've tried to do is look at what those situations are with those communities, engage with them, and then try and find solutions, working together with the community, where we can help to address their concerns as well as ensure that the park integrity is maintained. Well, so to give you an example of that, prior to working in Kasungu, we were actually helping the Malawi government in Luwande National Park. And one of the major problems that was being faced in Luwande was on the western boundary, where there's a substantial community presence on that sort of border, and unfortunately the water supply or the water source is inside the park. And so there was a number of incidences, unfortunately, where people were coming into human-wildlife conflict, and we had some people that lost their lives. So we engaged in the community because we needed to sort this problem out. We were having community members moving into a protected area, which then made the protected area vulnerable to poaching activity. And secondly, of course, we were losing human lives, which was then creating a negative impact for conservation as well as for the people who were involved. And so what we did was we set up a 6-kilometer elephant-proof fence in the Chikalongo community. And by setting up the fence, of course, we then limited people's access to the water inside the park. So we worked to set up a solar pump from the Sherry River about 800 meters to outside the park. This allowed the community then not to have to engage or get involved in any human-wildlife conflict. But it also presented an opportunity, because there was a water availability, to work on their agricultural aspects and improve those. So what we've managed to do there is set up basically a community vegetable garden there, which plants crops year round, not only of maize but also of other vegetables, which are then sold to the tourist operators within the park. And so therefore communities are then getting a direct benefit out of working in conjunction with the conservation agencies and the government there. So these are the kind of sort of real world approaches that we take. Unfortunately, more often than not, you see sort of NGOs come in with a predetermined plan of what they're intending to do. Our approach has always been to sit down with the communities, understand what their issues and problems are, and then see how we can work out a solution to those which benefits both the conservation as well as the communities who are living next door to them. it's quite interesting. And the fence was set up in 2014, and to date, there's only been one case of an elephant breaking through the fence. There was no injury or loss of life there, and within a half an hour, the elephant was able to be moved back into the fence, and the fence was repaired within 24 hours because of the fence attendance scheme. So there was real community engagement, and they could see the benefit of the fence and what it had done for them. And of course, there's been no loss of life since 2014 within that community from having to go into the park and getting either attacked by hippos and crocodiles, which was oftentimes the case before. But that's one way of looking at it, and it's very much dependent on, because we had a water availability and the water wasn't that far from the community, that we were able to take on this approach. So we don't have sort of a fixed model. We tend very much to be adaptive to what the situation is. So in the case of Kasungu, what we realized there was that there was a real need to engage the community in helping us out to build up the support functions within the park. So at present, all of the stores within the park, which services the fuel, ranger, rations, field equipment, is all managed by community members who then help the rangers out with ensuring that they have all of the equipment and all of the needs that they have to be able to effectively do their job. We were then approached by the Malawi government, who asked us to help out with ranger uniforms. They had a tender for uniforms which were very much sort of substandard, and so there was a lot of them that were made out of nylon, which was causing heat rash and just not durable. So we worked together with the Malawi government in recreating their uniforms, giving them a new camouflage, which is what the government had asked for, as well as actually producing the uniform. So at present, we have 6 community members who are tailors, who have essentially produced the majority of the field uniforms, not only for Kasungu, but for all of the Department of Parks and Wildlife in Malawi, and continue to roll this out. What this does is it creates job opportunities for people, but it also means that if a ranger damages a uniform in the field and doing their day-to-day responsibilities, that uniform is able to be brought back into the park tailoring workshop, and literally within an hour can be fixed and sorted out and then issued back to the ranger. So it becomes a very effective way of ensuring that your rangers stay motivated and are able to fulfill the important function that they do. The next area where we involve ourselves very much, because it is so linked to the poaching and park security side, is looking at the trafficking side. This is an area which I think everybody is very much aware of in this day and age, is the extent of poaching and trafficking of illegal species, as well as in some cases plant species out of it. So we've worked together with both the Department of Parks and Wildlife in Malawi and Zambia in helping them to set up wildlife crime investigations units. These units are run by the department, but we've been able to help them out with providing some of the equipment that is vital to them being able to do their job, as well as to provide them some training. This training also helps in ensuring that people that are caught doing illegal activities are able to be taken to court. The court monitoring is done, and then we also establish around the communities what we call a community enforcement network, and these are people that we work very closely with, who are able to be our eyes and ears within the communities around protected areas, in alerting us to any situations or anything that they're seeing which is out of the norm, which could potentially be an indication that there might be some illegal activities. If they're seeing people going into the park, and that they inform us, and that forms a proactive approach to addressing the park security issues. This is critical because oftentimes I've heard people talk about anti-poaching and anti-trafficking as though they are two different things, and while they are, they're very closely aligned. I mean, your trafficking starts within the park. So when an animal is poached, already the trafficking is starting to take place. That's the first phase of trafficking until the product reaches its end destination. And we as IFAW very much looked at it in that holistic approach. It doesn't help to have phenomenal park security if you're not addressing the trafficking, or having phenomenal anti-trafficking capabilities if you aren't protecting the park. And so we've worked together with governments in ensuring that that sort of capacity from poaching all the way through until a product leaves the country is addressed. And so we work together with the Department of Parks and Wildlife. We work together with the police units, the revenue services, as well as within the Zambia context, the drug enforcement units as well, which are all mandated to be addressing the trafficking of illegal contraband, including wildlife. And so we effectively work with all of those in order to try and create a deterrent for trafficking of wildlife. All of what I have told you, we very much, as I said in the beginning, is based in science. We've had a very long-standing relationship with Pretoria University's Conservation Ecology Research Unit, which is focused very much on elephant research. We use the African savanna elephant as basically a flagship in the work that we are doing. And in order to try and understand their population and spatial dynamics, we've worked very closely across the whole of the SADC region in creating this knowledge base around elephant science, which the idea behind that is to help governments and help communities understanding what elephants' needs are, and then how we able to create those synergies between communities and elephants, whether it's in land use planning or whether we're looking at a linkage between two parks, where elephants want to be and where people want to be, and see how we can mitigate any conflict, because invariably elephants and people seem to like the same landscape. So it's very important that we look at this from a scientific base, and use that information to make very sound conservation decisions within the landscapes and the countries that we work with. What I've spoken to you today about up until now has been very much sort of the big picture conservation thing. But IFAW as a welfare and conservation organization also takes into account that because of the poaching, very oftentimes individual animals are affected by that. We've seen that within the landscapes that we work with. A lot of the cases where investigation units or rangers have seized upon a situation, very oftentimes there's live animals, whether they're pangolins or other creatures that are involved with that. So we pay very much attention to the individuals, because individuals tend to make up a species. And to that end, we work within the region with two elephant orphanages. One is based in Zambia and the other one in Zimbabwe. And the whole idea around that is to ensure that calves and orphans that are as a result of these illegal activities are cared for, are able to be rehabilitated and released back into the wild. And we've had some success both in Zambia and in Zimbabwe with the reintroduction of elephants back into wild populations. It's still quite new, but it's something that we regard as highly important in the work that we do to ensure that we look after these individuals, because trying to do conservation but not taking into account the individual is, in my opinion, quite counterintuitive. So that, in sort of a nutshell, is basically what we do within the region, and our approach to doing it. So with that, it's short, but if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Great, thank you so much. We do have a few questions already. If you would like to ask a question, please put in the chat, and I'll be sure to ask them. So, all right, let's see. The first question I'll say is, are you seeing impacts on these landscapes from climate change?
We are. It's not as prevalent as sort of one day you're there and one day you don't, but very much from the science base, we're noticing that elephant populations are moving about and are being affected by climate change, and that is, by all indications, going to become more of a relevant issue moving forward. And so, again, that is why it's so vitally important that we use science to help understand this, so that we can mitigate against any conflict situations, as well as trying to work out what's the best way of dealing with it. Elephants, as you know, are very much dependent on water and water availability, and as sort of the western regions of the continent dry up, the expectation is that elephants are going to start to move more east. But equally so, people are also very dependent on water, so there's also a trend for people to move in that same way. And so that sort of competition for resource is going to become more apparent as time moves on.
Great. Next question is sort of a two-parter that I'm going to combine. So what are some other specific efforts employed to mitigate human-wildlife conflict, and which do you think have been the most effective thus far?
That is a tricky one. We found that a hard barrier is probably one of the best ways to mitigate between human and especially elephant conflict. But also it's a bit of a tricky one if you're trying to create a landscape that has multiple protected areas. By fencing each of those protected areas, you actually defeat what you're trying to do. So we have used fences where, sort of like on the eastern boundary of Kasungu, where we know that there's basically a wall of people, and elephants are unlikely to be able to move to any one of the other parks within Malawi. There we've used a fence. But in other areas, we've also looked at the idea of creating gardens where people can grow crops that are elephant proof. So in other words, we're almost fencing people in to allow elephants to move around them. We've investigated that, as well as just trying to see where potential human settlement might be, and trying to see whether we can't find solutions around that, where if there is a potential settlement about to take place, see whether we can't work with governments and the communities to see if they move just a little bit to one side, whether we could facilitate both people. So it is quite a complex thing. We've got hives up on our fences in Luwandi, and have had varying results from them. Very difficult to see whether they're absolutely deterrent in themselves. But all of these things are things that we're looking at as we look to see how we can mitigate this conflict.
Great. Okay, next question. How would you rate on a scale from 1 to 10 your efforts on community engagement? Are there areas where you'd like to see more progress? If so, what would you need to do that?
I think it's rather a difficult one to put in a scale. I mean, if we look at our Chikalongo livelihood project that we've worked on since 2014, we've had phenomenal success, and it's also developed into far more than what we anticipated. I mean, it started off as a sort of a 6 kilometer of fence, which then turned into a community garden, which then turned into working with the community, because they were sort of letting us know that while they were able to grow the maize, they were still needing to travel on average 50 k's in a round trip to get it milled. So we put a mill in there. So in that context, we've had phenomenal success. But I think one of the big challenges is that no two communities are the same. And so one has to look at the environmental conditions, the situation where those communities are, and what's the best form of engagement in those. So within the Kasungu one, we've done quite a lot of feasibility studies and working community groups to understand what their issues are. In trying to mitigate it. So it's a tricky one. If I had to look at the Chikalonga one, I'd say we were probably sitting at an 8 out of 10, but we can't go and replicate that model everywhere. So within the Kasungu one, it's a far more challenging one because it's a far drier climate, so the water availability isn't so much. So there we have to look at different ways of mitigating and bringing the community on board. We're always looking at it from the perspective of how do we bring the communities and work with them with the objective of improving conservation within the parks that they're neighboring. And I think one of the most successful ones that we've had in that context is working around the providing actual tangible jobs for the community. So like I was talking about, we had the community enforcement network, we've had the tailoring workshop, we've also used community members in our construction work. So when we're refurbishing buildings and operations rooms and stores and that, we haven't gotten sort of some big contracting company. We've actually brought community members in, trained them in construction, in brick making, in all of those disciplines, and then provided them a job. And so therein, it's far more of a direct link than what the Chikalonga one is, where we're looking at more of a benefit through tourism and concessions and lodges.
Great. So one of our participants has been involved in some of the work rolling out the use of the fingerprinting kit. Have you been using this, and have you had any success in tracking anyone in the supply chain?
It's been a very difficult one, and the reason why it's been quite a difficult one is because while the fingerprinting kits are great, oftentimes what we found is within the government agencies, there isn't the capacity to process those fingerprinting kits. They don't also necessarily have the data. And so it then becomes sort of a difficult process. So you can go to a crime scene, do all of the fingerprinting, but if there's no facility to move that fingerprinting through a chain in trying to assess who it is, it then becomes quite difficult. And that also then presents a question to those doing it, which oftentimes is rangers in why are we doing this if it's not leading anywhere. So I think in that aspect there probably needs to be further support given to governments in building up their capacity in more of the forensic sides. And I know that is being looked at within the region, is how do we help with the building of forensics. Like Namibia, I know, has a very good forensic lab. But how we can piggyback on the back of those institutions to help to be able to move the reason why you're doing the fingerprinting through to the successful prosecution of somebody.
Okay, next question. What specific things have you done to limit people's access to key areas that elephants like?
We haven't as such done sort of anything that limits them. What we've more done is see where there's this sort of layering of people and elephants. I think, we're also quite fortunate on the continent is that there still is quite a lot of open space, but where we have sort of intervened with communities and worked with communities has been more those that are on the borders of protected areas in assisting them with any wildlife conflict mitigation. And within the context of the Malawi-Zambia landscape, as we move across there, we working together with the government agencies in seeing. The other thing that's quite interesting is elephants don't take a straight line from the shortest point to the next shortest point. They oftentimes walk around, so it's more of a complex thing that we're doing. But that's sort of where our limitation has been, is in sort of working with the communities that are on the borders of parks and seeing what we can do to help them.
Okay, next question. Let me see. How do you incorporate wildlife corridors now with increased fences and increased population?
It's becoming a very tricky one, and it's one that we're working with the research to better understand. So we wherever possible try and avoid fencing parks in, because like I was saying, we work within a landscape, but there is some cases like within the Lwandi situation and within the eastern region of Kasungu where that is the only option. And we also know at the same time that just due to the sheer density of people, there's not likely to be any linkage between any of those parks. So there it becomes quite an easy one to do. Within the sort of the western boundary of Kasungu and into those parks, it becomes more of a challenge. And there we have to look at quite innovative ways, and are continuing to look at those innovative ways to see how we can limit fences or work in creating areas where people feel safe and elephants can move around them, as opposed to where you sort of locking elephants in so that people can move. So it's a combination of different things, all of which we haven't tried the sort of the full exhaustion of those, but those are the ones that we're very much looking at the moment, and we're realizing that we're getting elephant movement into those areas which we didn't realize before. So elephants are still finding a way to do it, and it's trying to map where the elephants want to be and then work it backwards from there and see what's the drivers of why elephants are taking the path that they're doing between these landscapes.
And here's a really easy question for you. What is your biggest challenge working in this area?
There's a number, but I mean, a lot of the challenges are day-to-day challenges. But I think the biggest that we have when we look across the entire landscape is just how we preserve in the best and most effective way, given that we are dealing with sort of an ever-increasing population of people, and that fragmentation is becoming more and more pronounced as we move along, and that together with climate change and just human settlement. So there's a real challenge is how do we get ahead of the curve? Because at the moment, the people aspect is and the development aspect is oftentimes moving a lot faster than we are. So it's keeping up with that so that we can still ensure these linkages and open areas for our wildlife for generations to come.
Okay, next question. Do you have any sense of how IFAW's work is viewed by local communities? Are they always receptive to change or outside support?
Well, what we have noticed is that I think within the landscapes that we've worked with, there is a certain element of donor fatigue. I think a lot of the communities have seen donors come in, donors make promises, donors leave. But we very much taken the approach, and that's why we take the slower approach that we have taken to maybe some of the other agencies and sort of donors that have worked in the past, is in really understanding and building that trust within the communities. And when communities have spoken to us, if it's something that is is within our means, we have addressed it, like the Chickalongo situation, where the people came to us and said to us that the two major problems was that elephants were eating their crops, and they didn't feel safe that their wives and children were going down to the water, and there was a very good, and oftentimes in some cases the real chance of being attacked by either a hippo and elephant. And what we found is that, and I think most people who have worked on this continent realize that that slower approach builds a lot of trust. So trust isn't easily won necessarily within those communities, but when it is won, it's a very deep one. And so with the communities that we've worked with, we've seen a very positive response to the work that we've done and working with IFAW. And the Chickalongo, like I said to you, that project started off in about 2013 and is still running now. So it's had a long longevity, and the community have realized that we're not sort of going to be here for a year and then disappear again. When we're in for the long haul to support them.
Great. So next question. This comes from an Australian conservation perspective. Much of the presentation of conservation in Africa and North Africa emphasizes large ungulates and predators. No doubt that IFAW's work in Southern Africa benefits other species movements like nomadic birds, butterflies, etc. What advice might your community engagement activities suggest about how we manage for the smaller critters as part of the conservation mix?
It is a very interesting question, that. What we've always done is, why we've taken a big sort of ungulate like an elephant as sort of the flagship, is that by protecting elephants, which we know like to move around and are big in and of themselves, we are protecting other species. It is a real challenge because like the question states, there's a lot of birds and other species are not. But what we're hoping to do is, by creating these sort of safe environments for elephants, we're also creating safe environments for all of those smaller species that oftentimes get somehow forgotten in the whole process. We do see things like sort of small primates and birds that are still traded, and there I think is where the enforcement and sort of the awareness of communities comes into effect of what the penalties are for trading in these species, which is illegal, and what the detriment is to the environment. And hopefully through a process of education and some enforcement, we're able to look after those smaller species which don't necessarily get the attention of the big ones.
Great. And sort of going on this, other non, charismatic megafauna topic, are you aware of any similar initiative with invertebrate conservation?
Not that I'm aware of. I think there may well be out there, but to my knowledge, I haven't sort of come across any organizations that are focusing on invertebrates within sort of the terrestrial landscapes as their sort of focal species in protecting these areas. I think I would argue that possibly there's an assumption that because you're looking after the big guys, the little guys are doing fine. But I think I prefix that with there is an assumption. It's not sort of a known fact. So it is a very interesting context to look at it as, are we protecting all of these little critters that oftentimes people aren't even aware exist because they're nocturnal or they're not on the human radar, so to speak.
Okay, we have 2 more questions left. If you have any other questions, please submit them in the next couple minutes, and we'll see how many we can get to. But as of right now, we've got 2 more questions left. The next one being, are you seeing any new trends in wildlife poaching or trafficking in the region? For example, different species, methods, routes, and how are those being addressed?
We are seeing it. I think the one thing that we have to be apparent about is if we look at our opposition, those being those who are involved in wildlife crime, they don't work within any boundaries. They don't work within any rule books. They just operate. And I think it's very much demand-based, sort of a trade. So we have seen, which is for us has been quite a new one within the Kasungu landscape, is we've seen an increase in leopard poaching, where they're basically killing leopards and then trading in the skins. We've also seen, as everybody's fully aware of, and I think has been raised at CITES and is getting quite a lot of attention, is the increase in pangolin trade. We're seeing hippo ivory being put in with elephant ivory. It's all of this is happening, which we're seeing as opposed to the good old sort of the ivory poaching as it was. I think what sort of those involved in trafficking, I think has become more of almost like the dark courier service, for lack of a better term. So we're also seeing within some of the seizures that the agencies have taken, that have done, we're seeing narcotics involved there, we see firearms, and we see wildlife all being moved in the same consignment. So I think the premise that we're working on is once you've managed to establish a route for moving contraband within a country, or within, in our case, sort of within the Southern African region, whatever you move through there will have a market. So like I say, we were not only seeing that there's specific people only doing wildlife trade and only doing sort of illegal arms trade or narcotics, but that this is all getting intermingled, all into the same people that are moving these along the conduits that they've managed to work out. Us being aware of that and working with multi-agency officials means that we, like in the Zambia case, we work with the Drug Enforcement Agency. We also work with the Malawi Police. We're able to bring that to their attention. And so I think there's quite a lot of learning taking place within those agencies to realize how fluid and dynamic this trade is, and bring them on board. So we've had quite a lot of success, especially within the Malawi context, with actually sort of interfering with the trafficking routes. I mean, Lilongwe used to be a very sort of prominent sort of hub for moving things through, but through our assistance of government works through intelligence investigation units and the wildlife crime investigation units, we've really curbed that movement. It's not to say it's gone away, but we've managed to curb it, and we frustrate those trafficking networks, because every time you manage to close down one of their routes, they have to go through all of the process of trying to find a new route with all of the challenges faced with that. So we're picking up very much and feel that we're having a great success on that trafficking side in trying to make life really difficult for these syndicates.
Great. So we have our last question. A pretty good question to end on, actually. Do you have a personal wish list when it comes to landscape conservation?
We do. I mean, I think one of the things is sort of the fact of working with the rangers, and if we're able to provide that funding or actual sort of in-kind donations of equipment and vehicles to be able to help these guys be able to do their job. I mean, the range of forces is one of those things that I find absolutely amazing, is these people that dedicate so much effort and time into the protecting of our wildlife. And the more that we can help governments in building up their morale and making them as effective as possible, the better we are off for all those species, the little critters that have been mentioned during this talk, as well as the big ones. And so if we're able to get some financial as well as in-kind help of vehicles and equipment like that makes the rangers' lives a lot easier and more comfortable, so that they're able to do their job, well, that'll be absolutely phenomenal.
Okay, great. We just have a few other questions come in, if you're willing to answer them.
Sure.
Okay, great. And then I promise those will be the last one. How resilient is IFAW's approach within the Southern African region to build capacity, rescue animals, and engage communities?
I think the first question I ask is how are you referring to the term resilient? Because if it's in the context of how dedicated we are to doing this, we absolutely. I mean, we have a firm commitment in the work that we've done. I think our presence within the countries that we are working in, while we're a lot newer in Zimbabwe, within Zambia, and in with Malawi, has proved that we're in for the long haul. It's not sort of a short flash in the pan approach. You know, in order to build that government support and work with governments, again, it's building the trust, and we've established those trust with the government. So I would argue that our resilience is quite high, if that is how resilience is defined within that question.
Okay, haven't seen a response from the person who asked the question, but so this will be the last question unless this person. Yeah, that's what they meant. They said that's what they meant by resilient. Okay, so this is the last question. Thank you for everyone for asking questions. If you have other questions that weren't answered that come up later, please email me, but this will be the last question. What incentives are used for community informant networks against illegal wildlife trade? Is it risky for them?
There is an element of risk for them, but for a lot of those communities, like I say, it's one of those things where it's an income generation for them. So the way that we operate is we train, and then we incentivize the community enforcement network. So those guys are trained up together with the rangers and the DMPW. We give those people a communication mechanism like a cell phone, and then they very much then work with us in feeding the information. And if that information then leads to an arrest, then we're able to provide a compensation for them in order to be an income generation for them, and it works incredibly well. A lot of these people then realize that there's a really vested interest in, and it's not only a financial one. I think people then realize the importance of conservation in having that close by to them when they also start to see tourists coming into parks and things like that. So that's how we work on our community enforcement and community information networks.
Okay, thank you so much, Neil. That was our last question. Fantastic presentation. And yeah, we ended a little bit early. So if you have any other questions, please feel free to email me, sweber@conbio.org. But look out for our next webinar in October. They'll be featuring SCB's LACA section, Latin American Caribbean section. And yes, thank you again, Neil and IFAW, for participating. This was a fantastic webinar, and everyone, this was recorded, and the link will be sent out to you afterwards, probably sometime mid next week.
Sarah, thank you very much, and thank you to everybody for coming on board. Much appreciated.
Thank you, everyone. See you next month.